Thank you, Shraddha. That was, very, very moving. I don't quite know how to follow that, actually. So thank you. Yeah. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start with a poem. It's so religious, exclamation mark. How did I not notice the bells and incense, the verses of gods and evil, the 100,000 deities above me? Blinded by the talk of compassion and dropping down underneath the sheen of life, I stumbled into the church, ready for my blessing, wondering now how I ever got here. So I wrote that poem on my ordination retreat 6.5 years ago. So one of the things that I did on that retreat is that I would, I think to process what was going on, I wrote in a journal, and I just found that my thoughts and feelings were coming out in verse rather than in prose. So when I knew I was going to give this talk on religion, that moment on my ordination retreat, that sort of part of me on the ordination retreat, the part that was a bit more doubtful about what I was doing, just vividly came back to my mind. Now, my ordination into the Tree Ratana Buddhist order is the most significant event in my life. There are things that are as important, I think particularly becoming a father, feels as important, but there's something about the commitment that I made at ordination, this lifelong commitment that I've made to follow the Buddhist path, that feels the most significant thing I've done. It's what I've put right at the core of my life. It's the organising principle that everything hangs around. My practice of the Dharma informs everything that I do. So how I describe that usually is that I felt like I went from being a parent who's interested in Buddhism to being a Buddhist who's a parent. My parenting is just really informed by my Buddhist practice. And making that lifelong commitment has been the most enriching and the most challenging act that I've ever taken. It's really helped me to grow and develop as a human being like nothing else that I've known. And I think it has helped me to get a little glimpse into the truth of things. It's the biggest act of faith that I've ever expressed. And it was my biggest experience so far of looking beyond my mundane life into something that has deep meaning and value beyond what I know. And significantly, it's felt like the most religious thing that I've ever done. So committing to the path in that way was the culmination for me of a search for meaning and value. It was the culmination of what I now regard as a religious urge. So when I look back at my life, I think there has been sort of this religious urge. Whether I sort of called it that years ago or even knew it was that, now I think there has been this religious urge within me. And at ordination, I was taking a step towards living a more religious life. And ever since that moment of ordination, I've been trying to work out how to live that religious life more fully and more deeply. But as you can see from the poem that I read out, amidst that deep sense of faith that I felt on my ordination retreat and that sort of deep sense of trust in what I was doing, I also had periods of doubt. And even though I was acting upon my religious urge, that doubt focused on how religious I felt the ordination was, or the ordination, the ritual, the ceremony around ordination. And how alien that felt in part to me, to the rest of my life. I've got a very ordinary secular life like everybody else. I'm a father, I own a house, all those things. I go shopping in Tesco like everybody else does. So somewhere underneath it, there was part of me that just felt a bit tricked or a bit duped. It felt like, I haven't quite signed up to be religious. There was part of me that was thinking that, it's not quite what I sort of felt like I'd signed up for. So in my talk, I just want to explore some of these things. I want to explore that religious urge and how that's manifested in my life, and how I think that urge is there for most of us probably. And I want to explore some of the things that feel like they can get in the way of that religious urge, what can hinder us in expressing it as fully as we can, the doubts, the forces, both inner and outer, that are working against us. And I also want to look at some of the things that Sangha has said about religion, which have really helped me to sort of navigate these waters. And some of the religious forms that he's encouraged us to set up and take part in, and how they can help us to grow. So yes, it'll just be a brief look at these things, just be a hint, it'll just raise some of the issues. We'll have a chance to discuss it more in our groups, or there might be sort of further reflections that you'll do after the retreat. And I do just want to say that my talk about religion is from the perspective of being here in the UK. I think if I lived in the States or in India, I'd be saying different things. So it's very sort of country specific, I think, what I'm saying. So firstly, this dreaded word religion. Artavardin said in his talk that he wanted he wanted this talk. But I told a friend I was giving this talk, and they said I'd drawn the short straw. Because obviously the term religious is just very problematic. I mean, we know why Peter wears glasses from his talk. Last night, the sort of dogmatism that he experienced in his teenage years, has obviously led to poor sight. So religion is, and has been, still is, very problematic. In many respects, I would say we're better off not using the term religion. It's got too many negative connotations for us. So I want to just be clear that I'm using this term religious poetically. So certainly in the main part of my talk, I'm not talking about any religious institutions or any particular religious practices, though I am going to say something of that later on. So I'm not talking about church or God or even Buddhist centres. I'm talking more about an urge, as I said, this religious urge that wants to look beyond the mundane and find meaning and value in life. And I do think that urge is essentially religious, whether we like that term or not. And I also want to take Bhante seriously, Sangha seriously, because in this text that we've been using, Why I'm a Buddhist, he says that religion is therefore a very important thing. In fact, it is the most important thing. So I just wanted to take that seriously and really look into it as deeply as I could. And it's been interesting since my ordination, because I do feel like more and more, I feel like a religious man. In some respects, I think this is a public coming out for me as a religious man. More and more, the language of religion, even though it can be problematic, speaks to me. It speaks to me poetically. Words like sacred and devotional and holy, disciple, blessings. I love the name of Adhisthana. Adhisthana means blessings, and I just love the language of that. I love the poetry of that language. So it seems to speak to me more and more, and seems to me be language that can express more what my experience feels like. So going back to this religious urge that I've had in my life. So I think I first had that as a teenager. So I wasn't brought up in a religious family. I was just very, very softly Christian. But I can remember when I was 18, sort of just having this quite strong desire for something religious. I was having quite a difficult time in my late teens. I was coming to terms with my sexuality. I found it really difficult to come out as gay. So I was suffering and, in many ways, just struggling to be who I was. And one of the responses I had to that was that I wanted to go and sit in churches. So I remember doing that at times. I would go and sit in the church and just soak in the atmosphere. And I think there was something about that sort of atmosphere that just really helped me at the time. It sort of gave me a sense of peace and a sense of like being part of something bigger. Because I felt like there must be more to this sort of small, narrow life that I was leading, a life where I wanted to feel some sense of freedom or liberation in some way, and it felt like going to sit in the church could give me that. But underneath it all, I just couldn't buy the idea of God. I couldn't really square that with my own experience. And of course, I would just hear time and time again the sort of, what the church would say about homosexuality, and I would see the fear and oppression of Christianity that the church and religion had been part of creating. So I just couldn't square the two things. So increasingly it just felt like to me like religion just wasn't an option. I couldn't find a way to make it work. So I settled for a life without God and without religion. I settled for a secular life. But I still had this sense of wanting some sense of meaning and value. So I tried to meet that in various ways. So after school, I did an art foundation course and then went to art college. So I looked for it in art, I looked for it in making art, and I did get this sense of purpose for a while doing that. But I remember at some point, in my time at art college, I suppose just becoming increasingly aware of the state of the world around me. So this was like the mid-1980s, a time when Thatcherism and Reaganism were just very, very, very dominant in terms of the world views. And I remember this sort of, maybe people of my age remember it too, this sort of threat of nuclear war. I think it was our version of how we feel about climate change these days. Like this threat of like the world is going to come to an end in some way. So it felt like, there was this, the world was just in a state, and very much the same way that Art of Arden was describing in his talk. And I couldn't see that art had a particular answer to that at the time. So I increasingly got involved in left-wing politics, and I also started working in mental health services. Again, all things that have value and meaning. So I really did feel like I was part of making a better world in some way through my activism and through the work that I did. But again, after a while, I suppose I just started to have more of a sense of just feeling quite ineffective with those things. Again, it felt like there was just this bigger, these bigger systems, political systems, societal systems, that were just really hard to sort of change in a way. I was just this very, very tiny thing in the midst of these big systems. And I was angry so much of the time. I just blamed politicians and the ruling class and the class system and the psychiatric system. I was just angry all the time. And eventually I just got exhausted with that. Now all those things are important and good. I don't want to knock any of those things. I was a good citizen. I was doing good in the world. But it was really when I encountered death. So when I was 30, both my parents died in the same year. My mum died very suddenly, and then my dad died a few months after that. And then my best friend died of cancer a couple of years after my parents died. So in the face of death, when it was experienced in that way for me, it just felt like art and politics and social work just don't have an answer to that problem of death. They could make life better, but they couldn't stop us from dying. They couldn't stop my loved ones from dying. So I needed something else to make sense of death in a bigger way. But in the absence of God, which I'd got rid of in my life, I couldn't square the idea of God. All I could look to was my secular life. All I could look to were the things in my secular life. But this question just kept going and going. And eventually I suppose I just realised I needed a religious answer to that. I didn't think about it in religious terms at that time, but that's what I was looking for. So it was only when I first encountered Buddhism that I felt I'd finally found something that could begin to satisfy that religious urge that I have. And offered me a way of looking at the world that seemed to just seem true and to make sense. And I'd felt I'd found something that didn't have God in it. So this search for purpose and meaning that I'm describing is something that I think most of us have, whether we call it religious or not. It'll look different for all of us. Peter and Elizabeth have described their versions of it, I think, in the talks they've given over the past couple of days. I think Sangha describes this predicament that we probably, most of us have very well in What is the Sangha? So Sangha says, we find ourselves in a universe without God. We are on our own and therefore have to try to understand ourselves afresh. We can't accept ready-made answers anymore. We find ourselves here and now in the midst of a starry universe, standing on the earth, surrounded by other living beings like ourselves, with a history behind us and perhaps a future before us. And we each have to ask ourselves the crucial question, who am I? What am I? It's interesting for me because I think unconsciously that religious urge, I think I see that get expressed in lots of different ways in the world. So every time I sort of drive past one of, like a tree that's got a little shrine to somebody who's been killed in an accident, I think as an expression of that urge. Or you think about a couple of years ago after the arena bombings, St Anne's Square was just full of flowers. And again, I think it's a way of people trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of suffering through those sort of creative acts. I think we've seen it recently with Notre Dame. The interviews that I saw of people on the streets of Paris as Notre Dame was burning. You saw the sort of floods of tears that people were in. It's sort of, I think that they were expressing something because there was something of that religious urge that had been affected in some way. But one of the things that's interesting for me, though I've responded to what I'm calling a religious urge, is just how uncomfortable and how much tension I can feel, or have felt, about the more seemingly religious aspects of what we do. So that happened on my ordination retreat, as I said. Even though I wanted what religion could offer, I felt doubtful about committing to it. On one level, it made me feel uncomfortable. And I still experience something of this, if I'm honest, although these days I think it's much more subtle. But those tensions are there. I bring my habits, my views from secular society, my expectations from living in secularism to practicing the Dharma. And I do feel like this gets in the way of me expressing my religious urge more fully. So I'm just going to give some examples of this. So, of course, one of the things that secularism has really challenged, quite rightly, are the issues around power and authority that we find in religion and historically have found in religion. So that's great. But what I find is that there are many things about the relationships that I'm working out in my Dharma life that, where I really sort of feel uncomfortable or question the sort of power and authority. So for me, that's there with the Buddha. Underneath it, I'm asking myself, is it that I really want God? Do I really want to just hand over my sort of self-responsibility to this sort of God figure? And it almost can become a bit superstitious, so it feels like I'm working something of that out. I'm working out my relationship to my teacher, Sangha. How do I stay true to myself, but take what Sangha has said very, very seriously, but not just blindly follow him as a teacher? How do I sort of keep my authenticity alive in that? I feel like I'm working out something in my relationship with my spiritual friends, both vertically and horizontally. I sort of think about my preceptor, the projection that I placed on my preceptor of wanting his approval a lot of the time. And at times having quite a difficult relationship with him because of that, because of the projection. I think it took me a while to sort of work out that actually he just wanted the best for me and to really trust that. But it's also there in offering friendship to people. How do I not get sort of a bit seduced into being the wise one, the one with a bit of sort of power and authority? How do I sort of make sure I don't slip into that at all? And I think I'm working out what it means to be part of a religious community. What are my expectations of our Sangha? What do I do if those expectations are disappointed in some way or aren't met? So for me, these things, don't always feel straightforward. I think there's also something about discipline as well, because again, discipline can feel like it's something to do with religion. And of course, we're very open and inclusive here in Sri Ratna. Again, that's really good. But I know for myself, it would be much better if I did the Metta Bhavana every day. I've had this experience sometimes of doing the Metta Bhavana every day, and I can see the effect that it has on me. I can see that it makes me more open, softer, more understanding. But to have the discipline to do the Metta Bhavana every day feels really difficult for me. And I think this is an issue that comes up a lot for people who are training for ordination, that there is a discipline, there's a training involved, and I think sometimes that can feel quite difficult. I'm also having to deal with the baggage that I bring from living in a secular society, where I think it's mainly the sort of views that I bring to my Dharma life that can feel problematic. So I think what typifies secularism is like a materialism and like I suppose a dominance of a scientific sort of worldview, and I guess a sense where we've lost a sense of the religious or the sacred. So again, some examples of this. I think consumerism is so dominant in our society, where the idea of buying things and of gaining status will bring us ultimate happiness. It's just very pervasive, and I have to be really careful that I don't approach my Dharma life in that way, that it becomes something that I consume or it's something to possess. That it's something that I get for myself. It's my practice, my progress, my enlightenment. And I feel like I'm having to watch that I'm not approaching my Dharma life too individualistically. Again, individualism, I think, is just so prevalent in our society these days. So I have to make sure that I'm not just being too self-sufficient, that I end up not asking for help, or not letting myself be vulnerable with other people, or not letting myself have deep and intimate friendships with others. Because that sense of individualism within me can feel quite strong. And I think there's something about technology in this as well, that I think again there are very useful advances with the technology we have, but I also see that it can keep our sort of friendships and our sense of intimacy at quite a superficial level, that we do everything through mobile phones, we do everything by Skype or FaceTime. So I think I have to really watch that I'm trying to dig deeper than the superficial levels. And I think even though I am more and more quite strongly a faith type, or I'm letting myself express that more strongly, I can be suspicious and sceptical about my faith and devotion. So it's like there is part of me that wants to test Buddhism out with hard scientific sort of rules. Is it going to really work? It's like I still don't quite believe it's going to work. It's like I want to have some almost like a scientific sort of proof of it. And of course, that's a very dominant view in our society. I think it can feel like we think that science will get us out of the problem of suffering. It'll help us to escape old age, sickness and death. So yeah, there's some of the ways that secularism, I think, really affects how I approach the Dharma. I have to be very careful of that. And I think one of the main ways, this feels like a more subtle way these days, but one of the main ways these days is something about falling into nihilistic views or falling into eternalist views, actually. But I think the nihilism feels very dominant because again, I think we live in quite a cynical, nihilistic age. So where that affects me is that I can end up feeling like enlightenment is just nothing, that a sense of no self is nothing. It's just like zero, it's void, it's dead. And it doesn't feel particularly conscious that, but I know there are certain practices that I do where I end up in that place in spite of myself. Or I think there's another side to that, is like I feel uncomfortable expressing my faith more more comfortably because I live in such a sort of cynical, nihilistic age. And I see that, I see like the people who describe themselves as faith types saying that they find it hard to fit in because it's like they don't feel like they fit in the sort of the worldview of society. It was interesting for me around the time of Sangha's death and funeral. I felt like for about 3 weeks I could just relax into being, just letting myself be a faith type. I could just be devotional. I could just let myself go. It just felt quite a relief. And I think we can see some of these tensions around some of the more religious aspects of our centre. So I think how we relate to the shrine room is really interesting. So working in the centre, I can end up sort of relating to the shrine room as like, oh, it's the room where we have a study group, or it's the room where we have a school visit, or it's the room where the classes take place, rather than it's the place where the Buddha is. It's a sacred space. So I think, we can end up sort of relating to our sacred spaces in quite a utilitarian way. There was quite an interesting little day away that Adhisthana Artavardhan and myself had to Liverpool. And what we did is we went into the 2 cathedrals in Liverpool. And when we went into the Catholic cathedral, we just went quiet. It just felt like there was this hush that descended on us and was just around us. And we all 3 of us just felt really moved by that. And we just thought, wouldn't it be great if we could have that at the Buddhist centre? That you walked into the shrine room and you just went quiet. Yeah, so I think those tensions are there for us in the centre. I think the other way that I experience it is thinking what sort of level of experience is appropriate for people to come to things. And often what's behind my thinking is like, will they be okay with puja? Will they be okay with ritual? And I don't want to scare people off. I don't want to put people off by this religious thing that we do, this mind-boggling puja, I think Elizabeth described it as. So those tensions are there for us in the centre. And I think those tensions are important. I think it's good that we engage with that tension, actually. I think for me, I know that in my life, I think I deliberately had to start making offerings and bowing to the shrine because I had to challenge something in myself, something that was resistant, and I think that was really good for me. And of course, my criticisms of secularism do come from a very privileged position. Obviously, secularism has done a lot of good. It's done away with the superstition and the blind faith and the fear and oppression that has been there historically with some religious forms. And it's meant that technologically we have made advances that have made our lives better and more comfortable. So I have to keep reminding myself about the good things about secularisation of society, but I think there are these downsides, and I think they do really affect us, and I think it's good that we get more familiar, more self-aware of the effect of that. So, in spite of some of those tensions and challenges over the past few years, I have just been trying to let myself feel more confident and comfortable with being religious, of letting myself sort of express this sort of religious sort of part of me more fully. And one of the things that's really helped me with that is to read and reread some of the things that Sangha has said about religion. So I just want to say some things about what he's said over the years. So I'm going to quote him quite a lot, so do try and stay with the quotes. So if you look initially, you'll see that Sangha has said quite varied things about religion. So back in the 1970s, in the lectures about the White Lotus Sutra, which are now in a book called The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, he says that in the West today, spiritual progress is more likely to take place within a secular context than within a conventional religious one. It might be better to present growth and development not in conventional religious terms at all, but in secular terms. The Dharma rain falls and the sun shines on the religious and the secular alike. So he seems to be saying, actually, we'd be better relating to all this in a secular way. But then more recently, in 2010, he provocatively encouraged us to relate to the Buddha as the Buddhist God, the God who didn't create the universe. And what he wanted to do was to really challenge the sort of more humanistic interpretations of the Buddha that have become more prevalent, I think, over the past few years. And of course, Sangharakshita's just, throughout his life, he was very critical of the more purely cultural accretions of Eastern Buddhism, the more superstitious, merely formalistic sort of elements of Eastern Buddhism. So he's very famously said that commitment is primary and lifestyle is secondary. And in Why I Am a Buddhist, he says that religion has nothing to do with the way in which I dress, nothing to do with what I call myself. It is a matter of the way I am, the way I exist. It is the way I naturally function in the world. But in spite of his criticisms, or his critique on religion, I do think Sangharakshita has encouraged us to do something essentially religious. I think his teachings are essentially religious. And what he's encouraged us to create, the context that we formed from his teachings, I think are essentially religious forms. He's talked about Buddhism as a universal religion. Again, Artavardin talked about this in his talk. So it's a religion that is fundamentally about what will help us to grow and develop as individuals, rather than the garments that we wear or the ritual acts that we take part in becoming the most important acts of the religion. But he suggests that we need to relate to this, Buddhism as a universal religion by constantly asking ourselves, is this helping us to grow? So there's quite a key lecture that he gave in the 1970s, I think, called A Transcendental Critique of Religion. So he asked this question in that lecture: how are we to make sure that religion does not become the means of enslaving the individual or stultifying, even of crushing the individual? And his answer is, we need something that will constantly remind us of the limitations of religion, that religion is only a means to an end, the individual's means of development from a state of unenlightened to a state of enlightened humanity. In other words, we need what I have called the transcendental critique of religion. So this is really Sangharakshita talking about Buddhism in the same way that the Buddha talked about relating to his teachings as a raft. So in that lecture, Sangharakshita goes on, the Buddha's teaching is useful for carrying us across the waters of samsara, but we will have no need for it when we have reached the other shore of enlightenment. And then he says, it's only by means of a critique that we can ensure that the means to the development of the individual remains a means and does not harden into an end itself. So he's really cautioning us against sort of just making, Buddhism an end in itself, that we've got to keep asking ourselves, is this helping us to grow? But importantly, and I can't stress this enough, he encourages us not to get rid of that raft too quickly. And I want to stress this because I suppose I've seen over the years I've seen people become mitras or become order members and then just move into conditions and contexts where they end up a bit more isolated or don't have the same sort of contexts and conditions that can support their growth, and that they struggle to sort of keep practicing. So Sangharakshita says, we need to apply our critique appropriately. Sometimes it is more appropriate to express appreciation. We must be careful not to knock the very ladder by which we are climbing, not at least until we are ready to do without it. So he's encouraging us to see the gift in the context and the conditions that we have and not to get rid of them too quickly, but to keep alive to the crucial question, is it helping me to develop? I think really what this is about is just holding the institutions, the contexts, just as lightly as we can, not getting too fixed about their form or what they do for us, but just holding them, with a lightness of touch. So far I've looked at the religious urge, and then some of the things that can get in the way of expressing that religious urge more fully. And I've just looked at some of the perspectives that Sangha has brought to the subject of religion that have helped me to make more sense of my experience. So from these explorations, I finally want to look at what will help us to grow and develop. I want to look more closely at this ladder that we need not to knock over too quickly. So Artavardin, when he explained what religion means, went to the philosopher Cicero. I went to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says that religion is a cultural system of behaviours, practices, morals, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics or organisations. I think what's interesting for me in that is it's a cultural system. So alongside his critique of religion, Sangha has just really encouraged us to create what could be called a religious culture to practice within. That's what we have in Sri Ratna. That's what we've got the beginnings of, a new Buddhist religious culture, where there are sort of practices and institutions and contexts that can help us to grow and develop and deepen our practice. And at their best, getting involved with this culture has just been so important for me. It's been important that there have been structures and contexts for me to get involved with, and they've all really helped to shape and focus this religious urge that I talked about. So through becoming a mitra and through becoming an order member, I think making those commitments just has helped to really shape my sort of Dharma life more fully. I think particularly with training to join the order, it just gives you some structures and some things to sort of start to put in place that just really help to deepen your practice at best. I think being a member of a study group over the years and now leading study has just really helped to deepen my understanding of the Dharma and to hear different perspectives on how different people relate to the Dharma and practice the Dharma. It's really helped to broaden my understanding of what it means to practice the Dharma. And being a member of a chapter, as an order member, we're all in a chapter which is like a weekly meeting where we talk about our practice. And often, part of that practice is that we confess when we've been unskillful. So that regular confession practice has just really helped me to deepen my understanding of the ethical precepts. So at their best, these are vivid, deep practices that offer me an opportunity to just constantly reflect on what it means to live a Dharma life. And I think one of the important things that this sort of religious sort of culture that I'm involved with has given me is a moral framework to refer to and to work with. Again, I find it that in Why I'm a Buddhist, Sangha emphasises that religion is really what makes you behave the way that you do. And going back to my ordination retreat, one of the most striking elements of that time for me was just how central and important the precepts became. It felt like, this is the way to sort of live out what I've committed to. It just felt like the path was just all there in the precepts. So like nothing else that I've known in sort of my secular life, Buddhism has provided me with an ethical framework that really doesn't let me off the hook, but is also deeply human. It's got a fundamental understanding of what makes us tick as human beings. And I feel deeply thankful for that it's not just about sort of eternal damnation and good and bad. It's about skillful and unskillful. And I think this religious culture also offers us a way of engaging our imaginations. And again, I've really found that with some of the things I've got involved with in Sri Ratna. So that my understanding of the Dharma isn't just abstract, it's not just intellectual, but there's like a heart connection as well. So that, I really felt that last night in the puja. It felt like my heart was just fully engaged with what we were doing. And I'm really enjoying co-leading and developing the festivals with Akshashradha and Artavardhan. And I think our festivals are a good example of how we can engage our imaginations more deeply. At those festivals, I feel that they're sort of part of this very human need for us to gather together and to celebrate and to tell the big stories in our lives. The big story of the Buddha's life. Stories that are much bigger than we are, much bigger than us. And maybe most importantly, this culture has offered me a community to practice within. So we've heard a lot about that, about sort of Sangha and friendship on this retreat. And I wouldn't be here without the friendship that I've received and taken part in, the sort of community I've taken part in. It's really helped me to sort of just stick and to deepen my practice. And I think being part of a Sangha, being part of a community, a religious community, has just really helped me to challenge my sense of self-centeredness. It's given me a training in learning how not to polarize, how to deepen my understanding of others, and how to be more patient. It's helped me to learn how to forgive others and to ask for forgiveness myself when I've messed up. So, in some respects, that feels like it's been one of the biggest learning areas for me, as just being a member of a religious community. It's really sort of opened up my Dharma practice. And then finally, this culture, I think, gives me something to look up to in the form of the Buddha. So I'm talking about relating to the Buddha as an exemplar, as a person who's seen through into how things really are, has really seen the truth of things. And I find that at its best really inspiring. The Buddha went beyond what I know. But the Buddha isn't separate from me. The Buddha is a human being as I am, and I can do what he did too. And Sangharakshita just continually points us towards the Buddha. He says that we need to get to know the Buddha, get to know his life and his teachings, and relate to the Buddha in deeper and deeper ways. And he says, in the absence of God, we need to find out who the Buddha is and how we should relate to him. So in Who is the Buddha, Sangharakshita says in the sort of final chapter of Who is the Buddha, the Buddha is neither man nor God. He was a human being in the sense that he started off as every other human being starts off. But he didn't remain an ordinary human being. He became an enlightened human being. For those of us brought up to imagine that the highest being in the universe is God, it's not so easy to really discern the Buddha in that position. Even if we don't believe in God, we see a God-shaped empty space, and the Buddha simply does not measure up to it. After all, the Buddha did not create the universe. We see the Buddha in this way because there is a category missing from Western thought. If we are to perceive who the Buddha is, we have to dispel the ghost of God by substituting for God something completely different. And he goes on to say, so who is the Buddha? We've seen that Buddha means unconditioned mind, enlightened mind. Knowing the Buddha means knowing the mind in its unconditioned state. So the answer to the question, who is the Buddha, is really that we ourselves are the Buddha, potentially. So ultimately, though I'm arguing that the forms of this religious culture can help us and support us, and that they are really supportive, and don't get rid of them too quickly, and that might mean lifetimes actually. We have to find the Buddha, we have to find a sense of meaning and value in our lives. We have to find the Buddha and find Buddhahood, find the true religious meaning of life, ultimately within ourselves, not within the religious forms that sometimes we can unhelpfully cling to. We have to take true responsibility for ourselves and be constantly asking ourselves, is this helping me to grow and develop? Is this moving me nearer to enlightenment? So finally, just going back to my ordination retreat, I think that ceremony, that ritual, was an imaginative act that showed me religion at its best. So there's two parts to the ordination, the private ordination and the public ordination. So within the private ordination, I felt that that was an expression of my personal, private, religious urge. And that got activated more fully in the private ordination. But I also knew that I needed and wanted to do that with other people. So in the public ordination, I committed to joining with friends in the order to practice together and to offer the hand of friendship to others. So again, something else was activated in that. Something that took me beyond me, that went deeper than this ordination is just about me. It's something that I can offer to the wider world. And the witnessing of this commitment by my preceptors, I think, saw something in me that I found difficult to see myself. They saw my potential in a way that I just didn't. And I feel I've been running to catch up with what they saw ever since my ordination. And for me, this has been expressed quite directly through the meditation practice that I was given at ordination. So we take on this meditation practice, which is called a sadhana practice, which is usually meditating upon a Buddha figure. So ever since my ordination, I've been meditating on this figure of Amoghasiddhi, who's the Buddha of fearlessness, the Buddha who's green of colour. And through that meditation, I've been given a vision of myself at my fullest, having let go of this fixed sense of self on the deepest level. For me, it's an amazing practice, and it's been the bedrock of my life ever since ordination. So I've imaginatively been coming into relationship with this Buddha figure ever since. And I feel like I've been slowly getting deeper glimpses into the nature of reality through that practice. So when I was looking through my journal for this poem that I read at the beginning, I found another poem, which I wrote a couple of days after being given that sadhana practice. And I just remember at that time walking around in nature, feeling amazed by the vibrant greens of the trees around me. And it felt like the green light of Amoghasiddhi was shining within me. I felt in touch with something that was just much bigger than myself. And I felt bigger, more creative, more alive than I ever had. But I also felt my smallness. I felt how small I was in the bigger scheme of things. And I wrote this poem later that day. He started to speak to me with light, in greens and blues. I listened and waited. Nothing just yet, just the sound of the wind in the trees, and the delicate flower heads starting to wither in the autumn chill. Thank you.